Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Valerie Bauerlein to talk about her new book, The Devil at His Elbow. Valerie Bauerlein is a national reporter for the Wall Street Journal who writes about small-town America and Southern politics, economics, and culture. She has covered the South her entire career, including 19 years at the Journal and 4 years at the State in Columbia, South Carolina. Ms. Bauerlein graduated from Duke University. She lives in Raleigh, North Carolina with her husband and their 2 children. Bauerlein will be in conversation with Josh Dawsey. Dawsey is a political enterprise and investigations reporter for the Washington Post. He joined the paper in 2017 and previously covered the White House. Before that, he covered the White House for Political and New York City Hall and New Jersey Governor Chris Christie for the Wall Street Journal. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Valerie Bauerlein and Josh Dawsey.
Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with Val, an old friend of mine. We worked together at the Wall Street Journal, are both from the South and South Carolina. She worked in South Carolina. I was born in South Carolina. We actually, one of the one times we worked together was on the Confederate flag coming down in South Carolina. If anyone who follows American and Southern history knows, it was a huge seismic deal in this country.
Thank you for pointing out that you outworked me on that story.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. But Val is a great friend, and the book is amazing. As of today, she's a New York Times bestselling author, so that's exceptional, and we're very, very happy for her. So I guess if you're here tonight, you probably are a follower of the story and sort of a sordid saga of a story, but we're going to start by just letting her give a quick Cliff Notes, why she named the book what she did, and just to kind of catch everyone up on what makes this such a harrowing and great tale.
Well, I promised you I'd do this in 30 seconds or less, so hold me to it. But this saga just really had everything. It had all 7 of the deadly sins. I went and looked them up. It really does. But Alec Murdaugh was convicted in March of 23 of killing his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul. And he was convicted of killing them, and he pled guilty to the motive, which was robbing the poorest of the poor clients in rural South Carolina of $10 million over the course of years. And the book posits that those crimes, the emotional violence of those crimes, kind of inured him to violence and cruelty. But more than that, that there were other deaths connected to the family. I think that captured natural attention. And then also, he tried to kill himself on the side of the road, sort of, which was Labor Day of 2021. Yeah. But the real thesis of the book is that every crime that he's convicted of or has pled guilty to has some predicate in the past. I mean, if there's insurance fraud on the side of the road, guess what? The family fortune was founded on an act of insurance fraud in 1940. Or if he committed violence against his wife, there's a history of violence against women in this family. So the book is about the history and really the place that we both love, which is the state of South Carolina, that was the petri dish that cultivated Alec Murdaugh.
Yeah, I guess you answered a little bit of my next question in that wonderful answer. But, this book has had this whole saga has had 9 books already written about it. It's had countless podcasts, Dateline, almost national attention. I mean, working at the Post, there's all of these cable screens in the office. And I looked up one day, and for like weeks, it was just his trial, cover to cover. And to knock Trump off cable news is sort of an amazing proposition. So what do you think made this story, just so compelling to people? I mean, people were just following this, day in and day out. I had random friends I had not heard from in years reaching out to me saying I'm following this crazy murder case back in your state. What made this sort of this larger than life phenomenon where people became so obsessed with this story and all of these people?
Well, I think what captivated me from the beginning is I love South Carolina. You're from there. I'm from just north of the county, the state line. It was it was a crazy story before the homicides. Paul Murdaugh was accused of, he was charged with killing a young woman in a fatal boat wreck. His dad, Alec Murdaugh, was credibly believed to have tried to cover it up and blame somebody else. So it was on my radar for that reason. But early on, just following South Carolina, I actually got a call from Matt Murray, who is now the executive editor of the Washington Post. He was our editor-in-chief at the time. And he called me in June of 2021, of all things, and said, "Are you following this murder in South Carolina?" I was like, where there was a wife and son killed on a country estate at night with no suspects, and then there's another death, and the housekeeper I was like, "Yeah, I'm following it." And he said, and we were talking, and I committed the ultimate Wall Street Journal sin, and I said, but what do we add? What is the Wall Street Journal version of this story? What do we add to this conversation? And he got really frustrated. Matt, and a lot of y'all do. And he said, and he didn't say, dang. He's like, "Dang it, Val, sometimes an effing good story is an effing good story," which it was. But I made my first trip down there in June of 2021, really when we didn't know much at all. And it was a great story because it's a story about money and power and the way power works in a rural area and privilege. And so, from the beginning, I think I was captivated by all of the Baroque nature of the story. But in the end, I think we were all captivated by the core question, which is, how can a man kill his wife and son?
It is the question that I think kept everyone following along.
I mean, it's just such a taboo. So it's impossible to imagine.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about place and tell people kind of where this played out. There's a famous quote about South Carolina from the 1860s, and it said, the state is too small for a republic and too large for an insane asylum, right? And I think there's something to that, right? That it's a wild state. I mean, the first story that Val wrote about this in 2021, there was a line as she began the story on the front page of the Wall Street Journal that was so vivid, and it sort of took me to the place I grew up on a farm there. And it said, "A driver can park on the side of the road in the sprawling expanse of farmland, forest, and swamp and not see another soul for hours," right? To tell people sort of who maybe have never been to where we were in that rural part of South Carolina, what it was actually like to be there.
And remind me to come back to the Pettigrew quote, because I'm not great at double two-part questions at all. But I do the side of the road story was so fantastical, because if you've ever been to rural South Carolina, where this happened, Hampton County, the population density is Loudoun County is 20 times more dense. It is so remote. You can go miles without seeing people. So if the shooting's at Moselle, for example, there's 7 shots in the middle of the night. It's a good chance nobody heard it. I mean, it's so remote. And one of the first things I did after the roadside shooting, when I was next in South Carolina, I went to where Alec Murdaugh said he was shot on the side of the road, and I parked and rolled the windows down and just sat there. And nobody came by in either direction for 30 minutes, either way. And it beggared belief that he'd actually been shot on the side of the road in a drive-by shooting. So it's very rural, it's very swampy, which means it's hard to traverse. So for a long time, it's hard to get from one part of the county to another. So people, it's quite isolated. But I think South Carolina, to your point about the Pettigrew quote, when I first started calling people I'd known for 20 years, many of whom are in the acknowledgments, including several governors actually, and former senators and other people, 3 people quoted the Pettigrew quote to me. South Carolina is too small to be state, too large to be an insane asylum. And I am from North Carolina. North Carolina is twice as big. We have 100 counties. South Carolina has 46 counties. And what makes it really different, and y'all have heard Nikki Haley and Mark Sanford complain about this, and they're right. New knows what I'm talking about. But the governor is denuded. The governor has no power. And that is a legacy of race, which imbues everything in the story. But after the Civil War, and after Reconstruction, South Carolina was 2/3 black. And it was very important to the white power structure to ensure that no black man would ever become governor. And if they did, they would have no power. So the way they handled that was to give all the power and the money and the control to the 46 senators. So essentially, there's one person in each county who controlled everything. And in Hampton County for 100 years, that was the Murdaugh family.
Right. And a lot of the small counties in South Carolina, that has gone away to some degree, but there are still bosses that kind of run
It went away to
county.
some degree because we don't have like one county, one senator anymore. But what was left with that is that there is still that family that was that picked the sheriff, that picked the judge, that picked the senator.
It's also a wonderful state. I would recommend you all visit
I
other
love
parts
it,
of it.
but
I'm not trying to
it's
give a bad
mess.
impression of my beloved home state, but there's also some very screwed up things about it.
I always tell people in North Carolina, I'm like, I love you, North Carolina, but South Carolina is so much more interesting. It's so much more interesting.
Uniquely beautiful, wonderful, and screwed up about South Carolina. One of the things I heard you say on a podcast with our sort of mutual friend, Tommy Tomlinson, was that the Murdaugh family moved to this part of the state in 1880s in Hampton County. And at that time, Hampton County had seceded from a nearby county, Beaufort County, because they wanted to be an expressly white county. Like they wanted to have an entire white population in that part of the world. And then I was reading an excerpt of yours in the journal that came out a few weeks ago about sort of the family's complicated past, all of the demons, some of them you described, the grandfather who killed himself, drove in front of a train tracks and let the train run over him, and the last thing the train driver saw was someone waving at him, right? Because he was getting fraud money. The family over the years had sort of dominated this county, but they had all sorts of episodes. This was not new. So I kind of wanted to hear you talk a little bit about what sort of race and the family's complicated past in that county, how that sort of played into this book.
You just can't overstate the case. I remember when I found the petition to the legislature where they literally asked Wade Hampton, who was formerly the largest slaveholder in the South, a Confederate officer who became governor in this very corrupt deal after Reconstruction. They literally asked him to make a white county, and I was like, did they put it in writing? Yes, they did. They wanted to establish a white county and secede from what was known as the Black Republic of Beaufort County, where that was the last fusion, the last Black Republican government in the state. So it's just incredible to me that that's what happened. But guess what? That's exactly what happened. And Alec Murdaugh's great-great-grandfather, Josiah Murdaugh, was a Confederate officer. And he moved his family to Hampton County right after it was founded, and to be part of the ruling structure of former Confederate officers who set up the place, ran the place, gave the money for the courthouse. The courthouse and the legal system was so important in those days because they were traveling by horse and buggy. It took you could only go 7 miles and back in one day. You had to have a courthouse. It was so integral to the life of this community that the town was called Hampton County Courthouse for a long time.
One of the things that was so remarkable that justice finally came here to this family was that how the court system in Hampton County had been run by these same people forever and ever and ever. Sort of illuminate to the crowd the firm grasp that this family had on how the law was actually played out in every part of civic life in Hampton County.
It's every turn in the story is stranger than fiction, and the idea that Alec Murdaugh is appealing on the grounds of jury tampering is really kind of fantastical because jury tampering was the family way of life, and what I mean by that is his great-grandfather, Randolph Murdaugh Sr., who founded the modern Dynasty on the train tracks, as you mentioned, with this massive act of insurance fraud. He ran for solicitor or deputy. He was the DA for 5 counties. And to say solicitor sort of understates the case. If you're the solicitor in a rural area of the Low Country in those days, every county had one sheriff, elected sheriff, one maybe a part-time deputy, and then a jailer who lived at the jail. And that was it. So if you were the solicitor for 5 counties, you were the law. You went and interviewed rape victims. You decided who got charged and who didn't. And he literally knew every juror in his territory. Alec's father actually signed an affidavit saying he knew every juror in his territory, all by name. And so over time, if you become the solicitor in 1920, they have this powerful civil law firm, which was not against the law in any way, starting in 1910. They knew every juror. They would do favors and be like, Josh, you got a speeding ticket. I can make that go away. Don't worry about it. And then 2 weeks later, your mom's on the jury, and she might remember that. And so the perverse kind of legacy of that was civil judgments in Hampton County over a period of years became so outsized. And one of the lawyers in the case, Joe McCulloch, would often say, $100,000 case in Columbia is $1 million case in Hampton County. So it was they had this lockhold on the justice system, but what that ended up being was also a lockhold on the economy. Because if it's hard to do business there, people don't do business there, and it became a very economically distressed place.
Yeah, one of the things for you guys who've read this book that makes it so remarkable are just the compelling characters that are in it. You know, Dick Arpulian, the sort of larger than life Columbia lawyer who was always up to all sorts of antics. You know, one of the last Democrats sort of elected really in South Carolina. There's a few left, Clyburn, but not a ton. You know, Buster and Bubba and Paw Paw and, you know, a black judge who sort of has his moral spine who's coming in to hear this case, and, you know, a corrupt county clerk. And there's just a plethora of amazing characters in this book. How did you sort of think as a reporter, as you were sort of figuring out how to tell the story in this book on character development and the characters that were most interesting to you, and how you sort of teased out these wild individuals on the page?
You know, I think I wrote my first story about Dick Harpootlian in the year of our Lord 2000. And just when you never write your last one, I saw him recently in Columbia. And when I was thinking, often I mentioned this to you, I was thinking about he says some pretty outlandish things intentionally. And I saw him recently, and I was like, well, you say some pretty outlandish things in my book, but did you remember Game Change? Y'all remember that book? He's a firebrand, and he's larger than life, and he loves the spotlight afforded the man in the middle of the arena, and you can't make him up, and you don't need to, because he's so incredible. I think one of the challenges for me about character development, and it was a theme from the beginning, everyone said, he's such a deeply bad person. You're asking people to spend time getting to know a horrible human being. Who is the reader going to pull for? Who are the people that are there? And so that really was a challenge to me, to try to identify people that were unwinding this corrupt system. And as it turned out, because you can't make stuff up, some of the people that were leading the charge were temperamentally kind of perfectly suited to. If you think about Creighton Waters, this tenacious rooster of a guy, and he's small where Alec is large. He makes $100,000 where Alec makes $1 million, but he became the foremost student of Alec Murdaugh and was relentless. He predicted where he was going to go in his cross-examination before Alec went there. I think the same about David Owen, who was the lead sled agent, kind of whose number was up the night the call came in. He just happened to be on duty. But I covered the cop beat in Winston-Salem. I see Michael back there, but I covered the cop beat in Winston-Salem for many years. And detectives are a funny breed. And David Owen is just a cool number. And he never lost his cool, either as a strat. Some people do as a strategy. We see it on Homicide: Life on the Street. He kept Alec talking all summer. I think about like Blanca Simpson, who was the housekeeper who was in their home every day. And I talked to Blanca at length, and I remember watching her on the stand describe his garments, like putting away his clothing. Well, he couldn't have been wearing that T-shirt, and she's muscle memory putting away his clothes. She's like, well, that shirt would have been here, and then I would have pulled this drawer out. So I tried to like identify other characters who were interesting and important to the life of the story.
How many years have you spent now sort of teasing out every element of a story?
29. No, I think that was a thing. I mean, you asked me, you could tell it was a big story from the beginning, but when I realized it was a story I'd been observing for my entire career of based in the South, and I couldn't have told a story in California like this or in Texas like this. I hadn't seen it, but I'd been to Hampton County as a young reporter for a kind of a Jim Clyburn thing. You mentioned Jim Clyburn, the legendary congressman. He had this thesis that if you took out the counties that line I-95 in South Carolina, they call it the Black Belt because the soil is quite rich. That's where cotton and rice and indigo were born, or were grown. And the legacy of that is chattel slavery, meaning that is where there are a lot of black people and a lot of forgotten areas. And so I'd been to Hampton County for part of a project on that thesis years ago, 20 years ago.
But the last 3 years, sort of intensely, right, has been. Like it's been sort
to the exclusion of all else.
Yeah,
just as my husband.
There's sort of a moment, if you've ever been a reporter, where you have like a breakthrough, right, where you sort of figure out something. You finally get someone to meet with you, and they answer these questions for you, and you're like, okay, I think I actually understand what the story is now, right? You have these sort of like epiphanies. We've all had them, right? I guess it would be curious for you in understanding how the story played out, right? And, obviously the dramatic ending and the conviction and figuring out what happened. But was there a moment for you where after you'd been there so many times and you'd driven, 4 hours from Raleigh down to 5 hours, from Raleigh down to Hampton County so many times, you'd interviewed hundreds of people in the state. Was there sort of a moment where the light bulb came on for you there and you were like, okay, I think I actually know what happened here?
I wish I could say it happened sooner than it did. I did spend a lot of time in Hampton County. I remember at the end of this project, I hired a wonderful fact checker named Julie Tate, who works for the New York Times. She has 2 more Pulitzers than I do because I have 0. But Julie is relentless, and so she's amazing. And she got on me about Alec Murdaugh's shirt that he was wearing the night at the ER that night of Mallory Beach's death. I called it a T-shirt, and she's like, for the 10th time, it's not a T-shirt because it was a long sleeve shirt, and a T-shirt is shaped like a T. So Julie, I knew she was going to call me out on this, so I was trying to prove to her that I'd actually spent 4 months on the ground. I built a spreadsheet of every day that I was in South Carolina, and I went downstairs to see my husband. I was like, you won't believe, I spent 130 days in South Carolina over the last 2 years. And I said, so 4 months. He's like, I would have said 6. But I did spend a lot of time down there, and the part of it, throughout the process, I spent a lot of time understanding the history, and I did have this core understanding that I think is really important to understanding who Alec Murdaugh is. Everything he did has an echo in the past. But the simplest revelation to me was just I had these immense chronologies, like 60 and 80-page chronologies of each event. And I think we were all like, how did Alec Murdaugh get to the state he did? But if you look at like the crises in American life, he started taking opioids in the early 2000s for a football injury. He was a walk-on player for the Gamecocks. Started taking copious amounts of opioids when you could, and then got hooked. And then it gets harder to get a hold of. He starts investing huge amounts of money in speculative development so he could be a big developer, big investor like his dad and his grandfather. At the exact wrong time, 2005, 2006, he loses everything in the mortgage bust. He's underwater, millions of dollars. And there's this big change in South Carolina in 2005 where the law that they call it the venue law, the law that had enabled the Murdaughs in part to become so wealthy was a weird quirk of tort law that said if I fall in a Walmart in Greenville and I'm from Charleston and there's a Walmart in Hampton, I can sue there. And so it was very generous to personal injury laws in that area, and it finally changed in 2005. So in the mid-2000s, all these crises were coming together in Alec Murdaugh's life, and that's exactly the time that he started taking advantage of his clients in a big way. Right. So that was a revelation to me because it made some sense in the context of American life.
Yeah. You told me once when we talked on the phone in 2022 about what a sort of challenging story it had been to report, right? But it had just been, trying to get people to talk to you, trying to sort of pierce a kind of veil of silence among folks in small towns who kind of protect their own particularly powerful, influential families. How do you think your sort of history as a reporter who knows the South and knows the state, when you were able to actually get on the ground, how do you think that sort of served you differently than maybe someone who's never been in that part of the world?
I spent a lot of time there, and in the beginning, they really felt under siege, and they were under siege. Hampton's a town of 2,000 people, and you would go to the county courthouse, and there were 6 people doing stand-ups on the lawn and trying to get interviews. And what I didn't understand at the time, but the first time I went down there, just like you do as a reporter, I called every county commissioner, I called every city council member. Hey, I'm coming to town. Can I meet you? Would you have a cup of coffee? Nobody called me back. And then later I was like, oh, that was Maggie's aerobics partner. Oh, that was Alec's best friend from high school. That's the guy who sold Paul a car. They all had a relationship over a number of years. And what the benefit that I had was time, and then also kind of getting there in any community, there are people who know, and if you can spend time with them, I mean, literally, y'all, it sounds so cliche. I I bought a bunch of bunk cakes and went and sat on porches and literally had lemonade. There was one time that I was like, "Is this happening?" Because the woman was so fantastic, and she brought out the lemonade on these little cocktail napkins that had a Confederate flag on it that said, "I don't care how you do it up north."
I love that so much.
But I also think, there's a reporter who's been covering this story, a friend named Liz Farrell, and she said to me at one point, "You don't understand what a passport your accent is." And I was like, "Am I offended by that?" No, not really. I mean,
you can use your Southern accent.
It's also temperament, right? I mean, I think that's why you're so successful in the places where people actually live, which is the South and other parts of the country.
Right. But a place like that, the point that you were saying is that just getting anyone who knew to talk to you at first about what the really perverse, insanely screwed up things that happened with his family, right? There was still a lot of folks who wanted to protect them.
And there's so much
because they were the most powerful family in the area, right? I mean, there was no.
I mean, you couldn't become a judge without their say-so. I remember one of the early bond hearings, there was a state trooper who Alec robbed a state trooper in a workers' comp claim, and he got hit on the side of the road. He went to Alec as his lawyer. Alec robbed him. And I can remember him saying in the bond hearing, "Would I be scared if somebody showed up on my porch? Would I be surprised if somebody showed up on my porch tonight with a gun? No, I would not." Because you also didn't know who to trust. And there was a legend, how true it was, who knows. But that the Murdaughs had fixers in every cell in a way in Hampton. And you just didn't know who to trust.
Right, right.
And certainly not the media. And that's me.
And there were how many reporters in this small town? I mean, you were describing to me.
Oh my gosh, I can remember walking into the courtroom in October of 21 for his first hearing in the Satterfield matter. And we all thought he was going to get bond. It was a white collar crime, right? And Dick Harpootlian says, "Bernie Madoff gets bond." But I remember looking around at the back, and I think there were 40 reporters, 48 Hours, 2020, Dateline, all the networks, Netflix. It was incredible. So yeah, and Japan, France. I mean, it was an incredible phenomenon almost from the beginning.
Yeah, this was a place who'd never had 40 reporters come for anything ever in history, right? They started bringing in like food trucks, you told me, right? And they were like, they had to basically create an economy because the world descended on this small little county in South Carolina that had nothing.
Creighton Waters, I actually happened to go up to the courthouse the night before the trial started and went on a wander like you do. And I saw Creighton Waters, who I didn't really know at that time, even though he's a key voice in the book. And he had on, baseball cap, T-shirt, shorts, and was just kind of wandering on the courthouse grounds with a dazed look on his face. And I asked him about it later, and he's like, you see all the satellite trucks, and there were food trucks set up, and one of them was selling elephant ears. He's like, the only thing missing is the Ferris wheel. I mean, it really was a crazy, crazy scene.
Yeah. You had the luxury of covering this for your book and going to the trial every day, but not having to write daily incremental stories on the trial, right? I mean, you wrote some about the trial. But
don't rub it into the beat reporters, because that really is true.
Yeah. What were the moments of sitting in the courtroom for you as a reporter that you thought, like, excuse my French, like, holy shit, like that was a wild, wild moment and turn in the case? Like, I know that you sort of took in every day of the case because we texted a lot about it and we're tracking it. Like, what were the, actually kind of, I can't believe this is actually happening moments for you?
There were so many. We weren't allowed to have electronics in the courtroom, so we always had notebooks, and I think I had 34. So I have this bin of 34 notebooks. And I was flipping through it the other day looking for something, and in the marginalia I had written, "Is this really happening right now?" Because it felt so dramatic at times. Some of the moments I can remember, we hadn't heard anything from Maggie's family, and really still have not in any meaningful way. And every witness of 77, I believe there were, every witness would go to the kind of this on-deck circle in the back of the courtroom and then to the row right in front of me, so who was coming up next. And there was this moment where I looked to the side and Maggie's sister was coming into the room. And she was, it was like the ghost of Maggie Murdaugh had walked in. Her name is Miriam Proctor, and she was so visibly heartbroken, and it was an incredible moment to hear from her for the first time. But I think the big one is we had been the biggest parlor game in America, I think, was, is he going to take the stand? And so you're reporting that out every night. Is he going to take the stand? Is he really going to do it? And there were all these lawyers saying, don't do it. It's foolish. But he really wanted to do it. And we had gotten a tip that he was going to. But when Jim Griffin, his defense lawyer, stands up and says, the defendant, Richard Alec Murdaugh, would like to take the stand. I mean, it makes the hair stand up on my arms right now. It was so incredible that we were going to hear from the man himself, good, bad, or indifferent.
Do you think there's a chance that the case would have turned out any differently had he not taken the stand, or do you think it was predetermined to be that way? Because there's some questions about the fact that they were able to show that he lied about certain things and the phone pings and sort of able to kind of cast him as a totally dishonest, bad narrator in their cross-examination. Do you think the case ends the same way if he doesn't take the stand?
Well, I think two things. I don't think he was ever been charged absent the kennel video, the famous kennel video that was discovered by plugging Paul's birth date into his phone 9 months after the homicide. And then here's this 90-second video that shows Alec had been lying about the most important night of his life. He's with them less than 2 minutes before they're killed. So that was this immense piece of evidence that led to him being charged. Once he's charged, his life is a minefield of awful behavior. And so it was almost impossible for the defense lawyers. I actually have some sympathy for them. They were asking a friend of Paul's, like, what was Alec's relationship like with Maggie? Well, they're very loving. Do you know any reason they would fight? No, I don't. Creighton Waters gets up and says, you don't know any reason why they would fight? Do you know he had money problems? And it was impossible not to step online. So I think with the kennel video, the only person who could say why he lied was him. And then once the door was opened by his own bad acts to all this other prejudicial material, it was almost inevitable. But I do think it did not go over with the jury, according to the jurors I talked to.
Because there are a few circumstances ever where a defense lawyer recommends that the client testify, right? I mean, I've covered, in a different life, writing about Donald Trump, for example. Trump always says, I'm going to testify, and then the lawyers always keep him from testifying, right? It always plays out this way. So it was so striking when he actually went on the stand, because it's the riskiest gambit you could make in the criminal justice system as a defendant, is actually testifying.
It really is. But if you think about it, it was his birthright to take the stand. When he took the stand, and he was looking at the back wall where a portrait of his grandfather had been, and they had to take it down because it was too prejudicial to the jury for it to be there. But Alex spoke at the dedication of that portrait. I mean, he had tried a case in that courtroom with one of the deputies that tested his hands for GSR several months before Moselle. His great-grandfather, Randolph Sr., got the nickname in that same courtroom as Mr. Fire and Brimstone, because in the days before amplification, you had to speak really loudly. And so it was, Creighton Waters from the beginning, he told me, I always prepared for the cross because he was not going to be able to resist the lure of a microphone and the chance to tell his story.
And he couldn't, and that was the right calculation. There are people who believe, even though he's been convicted and the evidence was so compelling, you and I both know some of these same people, but there's no way he really did it, right? He couldn't have really killed his son. He couldn't have really killed his wife. There's some other fact that we don't know yet. And I'm sure you've had every conspiracy theory and every sort of idea posited at you, everyone you've met. Do you think there's any chance?
And knowing him, it's actually not. They're all not that outlandish.
Right, they're not that outlandish, right? Because he's so crazy. Do you doubt any of it, or do you think it's obviously that's what happened? It's just clear as day to you.
Well, you mentioned a Republican strategist in South Carolina named Wes Donahue, who
he tweeted this week. I'm going to read the tweet. I'm loving Valerie's book so much. Alex Murdaugh is an evil man, but I still don't think he killed his family.
Well, guess where Wes Donahue is from? Hampton County, South Carolina. And there is a nexus of people, and I have many friends and many sources there. The closer you are to Hampton, in my experience, the less likely you believe that Alec actually pulled the trigger. There is a group of people who I admire and like, who think, I know he's a bad man. I believe he was there. I believe he hired the people that did it. It was drug dealers getting even or whatever. He knows who did it. He knows more. He's saying, I still can't believe he killed Maggie and Paul. That tends to be people that
responsible for it,
he was
didn't pull the trigger.
I think it's possible, if you know the family, you know the community. It's possible to think he was involved and still have it be hard, knowing that family, to believe he actually did it. And his older brother has said something similar. Randy Murdaugh has said he knows more than he's saying, but it's just hard. It's hard to imagine.
Yeah, and why do you think people who know the family and have been there for so long doing all the things the family has done, and sort of they're complicated and in a lot of ways quite sad history in that county. Why do they find it harder to believe than maybe an average person, you think?
Well, I mean, I could talk about my family, but you can't talk about my family, right? I mean, that's part of it. But then I also think I reread all the King's Men because it's such an important like document of Southern Gothic and politics. And Huey Long was like loved, feared, but loved. Right. And the Murdaughs, many of them were very loved. They did a lot of favors for a lot of people. Alec Murdaugh, I talked to Blanca about this. He carried around wads of cash in the console of his Suburban. He would just give, tips to people that helped him. He was the captain of the football team, y'all. He was the prom king. He was beloved in that community, feared but beloved. So I think there is a really complicated relationship with a family like that and a community like that.
Right. The thing that I think really has gripped people about this case is like, how can a father kill his own son, right? I mean, there's unfortunately way too much domestic violence in this country, and spouses, things happen that are awful. Obviously, it's murder. But I mean, the son, I think, has got so many people. I mean, I've had so many people come up to me and say, he loved this boy. This boy was his progeny. He was proud of him in all these ways. And he pulled the trigger on his own son. I mean,
I wish I could say
do people say that to you too?
Oh my gosh! So I was there every day. I was in the courtroom for 6 weeks, and after a couple of weeks, people were driving in from Ohio or Florida. They were lining up at 4 a.m. to get one of the few spaces in the courtroom, and I would often stop and say, "Why are y'all here? And what is it that captivates you?" And they would say just what you just said. And they'd sort of be apologetic, especially if they were women. They're like, "I understand that spouses kill spouses. I get it. I hate it. I can't understand how you kill your child." And there was a very smart federal prosecutor in South Carolina who really pushed me on this question, and I think he's right. He said it's but parents also kill young children. The last big notorious case in South Carolina was Susan Smith, who drowned her 2 young children, drove them into a lake. We understand that. Intellectually and kind of philosophically, it's very hard as human beings to accept when an adult parent kills an adult child. And there's almost no precedent for it. And so I was like, really? So I went back to Shakespeare. My daughter, who's in high school, was reading Macbeth. I read it with her. I read King Lear. And I was like, is there any precedent in Shakespeare? It's just Titus Andronicus. Right. That's it. And that dude killed like 100 people. He killed his kid, but he killed all these other people. Even in the Bible, if you think about Abraham and Isaac, he doesn't go through with it. Right. Mythology, Cronus eats Zeus. He spits him up. I mean, it's just so taboo that it's almost like self-killing to kill an adult child. And so I think that on some level was part of the whole morass that brought people into the story.
I'm going to ask one final question and then open it up to you guys for questions. So think of your best questions for Val, please. But you spent probably, all told now, thousands, tens of thousands of hours on the story, right? Between all the stories you did in the journal, the book, you've really immersed yourself in a way, and this is probably as the foremost expert of anyone in the country on this crazy, insane saga in our South Carolina. Are there still things after all that you've done, sources that you really wanted to talk to you, that you really tried to get to talk to you, who wouldn't do it, and questions that sort of still drive you a little mad? Or do you think you've plumbed everything you have here?
There are absolutely things that I wake up just want to know. I think the foremost among them is where are the guns? The guns we never found them. And y'all, I got to tell you, like a third of Hampton County is swamp, impassable swamp. And the prosecution gave us a lot of breadcrumbs, and I tried to tie them together for readers here. The times when he would have had opportunities to leave the guns, and the types of people who might, if he did have help, break the guns down and throw them in the Salcatchee River. Right. So the guns are a problem. The bigger problem to me, did he have help? And then also just, where's the money? And I think part of it was, if I did get the benefit, there was a federal trial involving the banker that helped him do all the criming, really. And we got the benefit of a spreadsheet with 10 years of Alec and Maggie's checking account, 10 years. So you can see when she goes to the Honeybeck Ham store. You can see what their orders are at Subway. It's insane. But you can see the money coming in the door, and you can see the money going out the door. And I was like, well, I don't think there's really a larger mystery about the money. Some of it's hidden, I think, for sure. Some of it, I think, is in PVC pipes at Moselle. I think some of it is offshore. I do. But a lot of it he just spent because he took a private plane to see the Gamecocks and the football bowl game when he could have taken coach, but they took a stretch Hummer when they could have taken an Uber or whatever. He spent a lot of money really fast.
Are there people that drives you crazy that would not talk to you for this?
7,000%, yes. But I did
Who's
talk
number
to
one on the list? Unless you can't answer that.
I'm not sure I can answer that.
Okay.
But I did talk to a lot of people. I talked to more than 200 people, and I talked to a lot of people that hadn't talked to anybody before.
Do you think he ever? And then
I guess maybe the person I would like to talk to is Alec Murdaugh. But you say that. You say that, but I can remember watching him on the stand, and then if y'all remember in Beaufort last November, he pled guilty to all the thefts from all the poor people, the motherless children, the quadriplegic, all the people he robbed. He pled guilty to the motive, essentially. And then he stood up, and as was his right, he gave a statement to the judge before he was sentenced. And Jim Griffin, his lawyer, stands up and said he wants to talk 5-10 minutes. He talked 45 minutes, uninterrupted, and he talks about his great-grandfather being a wonderful, honorable man, and I knew that was a much more complicated story. And then we were seated in the jury box, the media was, and I was sitting in the jury box, so I was, as close to him as I am to you in the back row, maybe a little closer, midway. And he looks over at the media and he's like, and I want to tell the media that the number you have done on my family is wrong. And I put my pen down and my notebook down and I looked back and I was like, seriously? The media is what disgraced your family?
Well, we're very popular.
We're very popular. Right, but it became, I had a lot of hope to interview him because who wouldn't? But Brian Sterling is the head of corrections. He is Henry McMaster's former. He's the longest serving corrections person in the country, and he's widely lauded. He was Henry McMaster, the governor's former chief of staff. And I asked Brian, I was like, and he was a college friend of Alec Murdaugh. I was like, is there any way? And he said, there's no way. There's no way. No one will ever interview Alec Murdaugh.
He never does an interview before he dies where he actually tells.
And he will never. And there is a strong chance because he pled guilty to all the financial crimes and the state viewed that as an insurance policy. If he ever got a new trial on the homicides, he has agreed to spend the rest of his life in prison. And y'all, on the appeals, I drove down to Charleston back in April to see him one more time in a federal case because I don't think we'll ever see him in public again. He will not have the same right to be in the room on the appellate level that he did on the first level.
Great. Okay, so we have about 17, 18 minutes left. Who has questions? There's a mic right here if you want to come over and talk there. What? Sure.
Hi. Loved the book. I wanted to find out.
This is my former roommate in Columbia, Megan Hughes Hammerline.
We're good buddies. But my question is about Buster. That was the lingering breadcrumb for me. And I just want to know your first person, like what was your experience? Because obviously there's a lot of questions, his behavior in the trial, questions about Stephen Smith, lots of, obviously his academic problems, your interactions with him. And then it's a two-part question because I know you love those. And if you want to get out of the Buster question, anything that was on the cutting room floor that you really wanted to tell in this story.
I'll divide the question, take the second part last, but I promise I'll answer the Buster question. The thing that breaks my heart, this is a really long book. The longest story I ever wrote for the Wall Street Journal was 3,500 words. This book is 128,000 words, which is kind of bananas. And I had another 60 I would have loved for y'all to read. And you might be surprised, I don't know if we've ever talked about this. The Murdaugh's relationship with Gamecock football is unbelievable. It's unbelievable. The chicken curse is a real thing. I mean, like Pitchfork Ben Tillman, there's this, I'll try to make this short. He comes to the Horseshoe because the upstate is where all the farmers are, all the whites are, and the Columbia families that control everything and the Charleston families are not giving them enough money. So Pitchfork Ben Tillman comes to the Horseshoe with a pitchfork and puts it in the middle of the ground and says, curses on the Gamecocks. And then the Gamecocks, as y'all know, or if you follow football or any sport, are up and down. So,
mainly down.
Sometimes, but then when they're up, you're like, yes, this is amazing. But what is crazy, y'all, is that in the early 1900s, football was understood to be barbaric. There was no, there were no safety equipment to speak of. There was no forward pass. A guy named Heisman was trying to change that and have a forward pass so it wouldn't be an all defensive game. And the referees were very corrupt. So you could pay the referee and he would just look the other way. And what happened was somebody beat the shit out of Teddy Roosevelt's kid in a Yale-Harvard game, and Teddy Roosevelt went on a campaign to ban football and was very successful, including at University of South Carolina. So they banned football in Randolph Murdaugh's sophomore year. It was such a blow to the campus, he transferred schools. He went to the Naval Academy of all places, and then because he had chronic heart problems, which come up with his death, they sent him back. And so he comes back to campus. He's a football star. He leads a campaign to bring football back. They march on the trustees meeting and successfully bring Gamecock football back, and then go on to be involved in the naming of every coach until the 70s. I mean, it's documented. It's crazy. And so that part to me broke my heart, because it's, in the end, everything's in service of y'all. Like, what do y'all actually really need to know about how we got here? Everything in the history has to tell you that. And the football was the aside, but it is bananas.
Premium content.
Oh my God, no kidding. Avery Wilkes, a reporter in South Carolina who was a fantastic reporter on this case, and he had the Murdaugh mega thread, former sports reporter. He's like, you got to do a podcast on that. I was like, podcast is not my spiritual gift, dude. So.
Who's next?
Hi. Not so much a question as a comment. I was struck throughout the trial about the dichotomy of the lower level people, the lower class people, or the middle class people who were just doing their job, like the CFO, and you mentioned Blanca, who did them expertly, were highly conscientious, and they ended up being the ones that really hung him because of their exact processes. And as you mentioned, Blanca knew exactly where the shirts were or were not, and the CFO was tenacious and exact. So I think there's a story there, and the opposite of Alec and, Paul leaving his gun around, and kind of the excess living and the getting away with things. So it just seemed like a good story.
I think you're
classes.
exactly right about that. It is a story about class as much as anything. And there were several women, and you mentioned Blanca Simpson, also Shelley Smith, the night nurse from Miss Libby, Alec's mother at Almeida, who said he wasn't there 30 to 45 minutes. I know exactly how long he was there, and she was visibly shaking. I can remember watching. She had on a pearl necklace, and you could see it shaking, and she was in tears. And so Blanca, Jeannie Seckinger, all these people. And at the end, I thought Creighton Waters did a fairly masterful job. And he's like, so what about Shelley Smith? Is she lying? We watched her. Is she lying? All these other people are mistaken, and you're telling the truth. It was devastating, because I think people in the courtroom, especially the jury, which was mostly blue collar, and really at the beginning, mostly women, could see who was real. And John Metters, the prosecutor, the assistant prosecutor, in his closing said as much. He's like, think about the Velveteen Rabbit. Shelley was real. Is Alec Murdaugh real? No, not a bit. The Buster question, which I did not dodge effectively, according to the front row. It was a tiny courtroom. So it's from the 1820s, so it's very tall and soaring, but it's very compact. So if I'm on the witness stand and you're in the jury, I can almost touch you. So like when the juror passes a tissue, it's because they're that close. It's a very intimate space. And similarly, the front half of the room was 100 people that were there every day. And that's the media, the prosecutors, the cops, the families. And so I was feet away from all the Murdaughs every day, and they're very cordial. And we spoke and exchanged pleasantries. Buster Murdaugh is 6'2". His dad's 6'4", but Buster is 6'2", and his hair. I actually put it to myself as a challenge, because his hair is so red. It's this shade of red and orange that's so intense. I tried to make myself describe it, but the best way I could say is, like, if you were in Williams-Brice Stadium on a Saturday and he was across the 50-yard line from you, you would see him. So it's very hard for Buster Murdaugh to move on with that hair and that name in that community. He stayed in Beaufort County. he did plagiarize his then girlfriend, now fiance's paper in law school. His dad did take money, it's documented, from the Satterfield boys, Gloria Satterfield's sons. He stole money from them and used that. I called the fixer, Butch Bowers, when I found it in the federal documents. I was like, the Satterfield money comes on this date, and the check to you goes out the next day. I mean, it was Buster benefited from privilege and according to everyone, many people I've talked to acted like it. So, but I do have great sympathy for anyone who is in that position, and I think he's in a hard position. It's tough. We don't know. He has been adamant he had no involvement in this Stephen Smith case, and I want to be very clear about that. But the Murdaughs were somehow involved in that investigation, which is still ongoing. We still don't know what happened to Stephen Smith and why he was left for dead in the road in 2015. That's also one of the biggest unanswered questions. But the grand jury is meeting on that as ongoing basis, so we may know in coming months.
Yeah, there's also with the rich people. There's often a lot of unhappiness behind the hedges, right? Like
I think that was an element of why people cared so much about the story. Wes Donahue texted me the other day. He's like, this line, they had everything and they had nothing. And that struck me. I was looking at the People magazine where Maggie's in furs, they're in cummerbunds and tuxes, and they're going to a debutante ball. And they had everything on paper, and it was empty and soulless. And I think that also, that dichotomy really captivated people. Okay, can I give a shout out? This is my friend Brendan, who has a cool podcast called History Nerds United. He wrote one of the first, I'm not saying that authors prowl Goodreads and read reviews from early readers, but maybe they do. And I remember wondering, Brendan had this wonderful review, but very well written, funny review of it. And I was like, all right, Brendan D. And then he contacts me and he has a podcast and I was on it. So please listen to it. History Nerds United.
Yes, please. I need all the help I can get. I didn't get to ask you this one, Val, but you talked about Alex.
We only talked an hour, I think.
Yeah, just only an hour. You talked about that Alex should probably not see the light of day again, but with how diluted and arrogant he is, do you think that he thinks he'll somehow get out of this still, or do you think he's finally accepted that somebody got him?
I think two things can be true at the same time. And I think that he is appealing on every level. He is a disbarred lawyer, but a lawyer who is appealing multiple, I can't remember, it's 3, but multiple convictions. And even, so yeah, I think he's running out that clock. But y'all, I mean, Dick Harpootlian told me this when he did not make bond that first hearing and white collar criminals get bond. Dick Harpootlian told me, he's like, he is the first white collar criminal I've ever represented who did not call me every day and say, get me out of here. This is a misery. Because county jail is tough. Richland County Jail is tough. And he's like, no, he took to it like a duck to water. And that, my understanding, I hate to say that, but
he liked it?
Y'all heard him on the jail calls with Buster, where he's saying, well, I need you to put money in Josh's commissary, and then I'll give him $10, and he gives me the $50 because I need more money. He's running. There's a historian who wrote a great book called Masters of Small Worlds, and it was about yeoman farmers. It was about poor white farmers in South Carolina in the 1800s, and it was just such a wonderful phrase, masters of small worlds. So he was a master of a small world in Hampton. He's a master of a smaller world, but y'all, he is running the same system inside the prison, from what I understand, because he is who he is.
We have time for a couple more questions if anyone has one. Here comes someone.
Hi. I wrote mine on my phone, so it's great to be able to ask you a question. I'm about 17 chapters into the book right now, so I haven't quite broken halfway. But already you're painting a picture of isolation between Hampton County and like the rest of greater South Carolina. I'd be interested to hear in your perspective of how much of that is based on the kind of insidious manipulation on the hands of the Murdaugh family, and how much of that is due to some of the complacency of maybe the more privileged people who do live in that city, who kind of maybe symbiotically are able to leech off of that power structure. That is to reference kind of the people that you mentioned before, people who stayed silent because they either sold Paul a car or they worked with Maggie. So this is kind of a weirder question because it maybe it raises the blame a little bit more to like more of a meta structure. But do you think that some of the more privileged groups in Hampton County relied on the Murdaughs and to, in other words, maintain the status quo so that they'd be able to climb the ladder in their own way? Like, essentially, was it the chicken, the egg, or a little bit of both? So I'd be interested in hearing your perspective.
No, I think that's a fantastic question because I think one of the things we do at the Journal is study systems, right, and subcultures, and it's a system. And again, multiple things can be true at once. I think Hampton County is isolated by choice, but also by geography. It is far, y'all. It's an hour from Charleston. It's an hour and a half from Columbia. It's an hour to Savannah. You know, if you're gonna, it's tough to be pregnant there because you got to drive an hour. This is a friend of mine who has 2 wonderful children. But you have to drive an hour to go to your OB visits once a month. Y'all, that's ridiculous. But it's a tough place. It's far and it's isolated, and that's its own thing. It also, I remember the day I found out that they literally built a fence around the entire county. Can you believe that? Is that not a little too on the nose? But until the advent of the automobile, when that became untenable. But I also think, do y'all remember that great speech that David Foster Wallace gave on a graduation where there's two young fish swimming this way and an older fish swimming that way, and the older fish swims by and says, "How's the water?" And the fish keep swimming, and they're like, "What's water?" And I think even if you talk to like Michael DeWitt, who's the editor of the Hampton County Guardian, who I consider a friend and a terrific journalist who wrote a really good book about it, he said, it was just hard to even see it. He grew up. He went to high school with the Murdaughs. He took Buster's picture when he won a Boy Scout award for the front page of the Guardian, and now Buster's suing him for defamation for things he said. I mean, I think the bank. Alec was a quarterback. You could throw a football from the law firm and hit the bank, and the chairman of the bank was Alec's godfather, and Russell Lafitte, the banker, the executive who ran the bank, was his backdoor neighbor. They carpooled together and had the same babysitter growing up, same age. And he's married to Jeannie Seconder. He's married to Jeannie Seconder's sister-in-law from the law. So it's just so close. I cannot tell you how close the community is. So I think the insidious nature of those types of relationships, sometimes you're boiling in the water and you don't see it.
Creepy that you went to the site for 30 minutes in the rural area and just waited. I get it.
Katie Stutch is a more intrepid reporter than I am, so it is not creepy in her view.
But were there ever moments where you felt unsafe, threatened, or just plain creeped out?
Yes, particularly early on. And when I was in Winston-Salem, we had a big scandal involving the very corrupt sheriff's office, and I actually was followed once, which was weird. And it's a creepy feeling. And so, and I've been a reporter for 29 years, and it had not happened again until my first trip to Hampton County. And I mentioned it to my Bible study. Most of the women are a little bit older than me, and one of them's married to a retired general, and he called me. He's like, "Valerie Bauerlein, you're not allowed to go out back there again without somebody with you." And so, yeah, I was scared.
Who followed you? You can't say that?
I can't say. But it was scary. I mean, and I don't really scare that easily if you're doing your job according to your training, But anyway, it was scary. So
how did you figure out you were being followed? Can you say that?
I did. Well, the same car, I kept going places, and the same car was like, I was like, wait a second. That car was, you're just aware enough of it. And it's a small town, y'all. Like the first time I went to the McDonald's, there's a McDonald's there. And I went to the McDonald's, went inside to order a Diet Coke because they have the best ice. Y'all know that. And the woman comes around the counter to give it to me. She goes, "Honey, you're not from here. I don't know you." And I'm not from there. And she didn't know me, right? But yeah,
Yes, I did not know you were followed. That's wild.
It was unsettling. But I think like many of y'all are journalists and really good ones. And in any case, as you get to know your sources and as they understand the story you're trying to tell, there's often Sherpas in communities or Sherpas in stories that help be your guides and not vouch for you, but at least go with you, accompany you. And I was fortunate enough to really forged some good relationships in Hampton with people that I think I'll know the rest of my life.
We have time for one more question if anyone has any, and then we've got to wrap it up, I think.
So this is a systems question. So the Murdaughs ran the justice system, Hampton County, forever. And then Alec was on trial, and there are a bunch of brave people, and the system worked. So why is that? Was it just the brave people, or like how did that happen?
No, it's a fantastic question. And I think until the very end, I did not think he was going to get convicted, because I sat through voir dire. And when you're in a community like Walterboro, South Carolina, population 19,000 people, they sent summons to 900 jurors, which meant if you were at church on Sunday with 100 people, 5 of y'all got summons. Oftentimes, I can remember there would be couples there that were married. There was a couple there that was divorced. They had to stand up and say their marital status, and the guy was like, "I'm divorced from her." So it was and then, the connections were so close. Mallory Beach, the young woman who was killed in the boat crash, her first cousin wasn't disqualified. I mean, that was not a close enough relationship. The deputy who was the third person on the scene who helped move Paul's dead body, his brother was put on the jury. I mean, the relationships were so close. And so it was hard for me to envision, knowing what I knew about Hampton and Colleton counties, that there wouldn't be just one person, because the state needed 12, the defense needed 1. And as you remember, we did have a juror removed on the very last day. Mm-hmm. And the defense had considered her their best chance for a hung jury. She was the one who laughed at Dick Harpootlian's jokes. And at any rate, but you know what's funny? I saw this great analysis, I think it was on NPR, at the very end of the trial, and they interviewed the showrunner for Law and Order SVU. Like, what is it about this case that had so many people tuned in? And he talked about it had everything, but what works for Law and Order and has for 30 years or however long is you see this horrific crime, you see people the cops trying to figure it out, you see the lawyers figuring it out, and 9 times out of 10, right prevails. And it satisfies our view that we live in a just world. And so Alec Murdaugh's conviction, I think, was satisfying on that way. Like, did the system finally sort itself out in a place like that?
Thank you all for coming tonight. It was a privilege to be with you.
Thank y'all. This is like a career hire for me, and I just want to thank all y'all, about 40% of whom I know, for being here.
Buy a book. I think Val's going to be signing some books. So anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Just as a reminder, we do have the